But in terms of just like general broader policy related discussions and things going on, that's left to the individuals at the university, not to the university itself. So away for a little bit, just because with so much going on, it's a bit of drinking like it's a bit like drinking from a fire hose right now. And I tend not to want to talk about things going on unless there's something that is time sensitive, but also because there's so much going on that things say one thing and another thing comes out to contradict it a little bit later. So I prefer to wait until I can know what's going on. But there is something interesting that's been happening. Now, the few of you are probably, if you've been on this channel long enough, familiar with institutional neutrality statements, or the idea therein being that basically the institution, the university, what have you, should not make statements on things that are not actually related to its purpose and mission. Should not make statements on things going on in society and the like. But if there's something that, say, affects academic freedom or anything like that, then they should. And the idea being that the individuals at the university can say whatever the heck they want, and they should, but that if you don't let the institution itself take no stand on anything as effectively, well, not no stand on anything exactly, but when you basically having an institutional neutrality statement, is the idea is that you put more power into the people who are at a different institution to speak their minds freely, rather than having the weight of whatever the institution is saying something in particular, and therefore folks are less inclined to have a dissenting point of view. This has actually been interesting because Heterodox Academy, this is the Heterodox Academy Substack, Freebie Inquiry, which if you're not reading it, you should, because it's interesting. I definitely don't agree with them all the time, but it is interesting. Published March 11th, so this is last week, but I thought it would be useful to talk about with institutional neutrality sweeping across higher ed. And this is actually the graphic in question from the report that they published in March, with the accumulation of statement neutrality policy options, which is to say institutional neutrality statements, here, adoptions from 1967 to 2024. And this was a really interesting report itself. And I'm going with this just because it's a nice summary of the report. But I encourage you to go read the report too, because it's got some interesting things going on with it. The world of higher education appears to be in constant flux, with a series of major changes, some good, some not so good, reverberating through universities across the country. Amidst the chaos, one positive development has materialized: the growth of institutional neutrality. Covered in the New York Times, which March 11th, by the way, that's what I'm not saying today, Heterodox Academy's just out latest report, The Rising Tide of Statement Neutrality in Higher Education, How Universities Are Rethinking Institutional Speech, explores the trends in the recent wave of institutional statement neutrality adoptions at universities in North America. While the HXA policy team continues to develop thoughtful and principled analyses of ongoing issues, advocating for institutional neutrality, the commitment of universities and their leaders to not weigh in on issues that do not directly affect their missions — that's a better way to say it than I did — remains a top priority. Institutional neutrality, also referred to as institutional statement neutrality or simply statement neutrality, ensures that the university remains the, quote, home and sponsor of critics, but that it is not itself the critic. That comes from the Calvin Report, which is actually what got us into the idea of institutional neutrality in the 60s. It allows for institutional leadership to reflect carefully on what issues have immediate and material consequences for their campuses, and refrain from weighing in on issues that are largely orthogonal to the mission of their institutions. What does our new report find? In short, adoptions of institutional neutrality policies have soared over the past year. As of the end of 2024, 148 universities had such policies or commitments in place, a welcome increase from the 18 known adoptions prior to 2024. That's the reason this graphic looks the way it does, because it's literally like the 18-ish total right here, and all of a sudden a huge amount in 2024. This has been a long time coming. Though the seminal Calvin Report was published in 1967, official commitments to institutional statement neutrality were few and far between for the half century afterward. It appears that the intense escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2023 put universities and their leaders under pressure to weigh in on a complex issue that did not break neatly across ideological divides, and in fact seemed to reveal a cleavage in the left of center constituency that largely comprises higher education. Instead of wading into a hotly contested controversy and risk alienating members of their communities, many university leaders and decision-making bodies instead champion values of community and inclusion, free speech and academic freedom, public trust, and the necessity of balancing rights and responsibilities, all of which were found to be recurring themes in their official announcements of neutrality. Public universities, as well as research-heavy institutions, are leading the pack of institutional neutrality adoptions. Our analysis shows that 115 of the known neutrality adoptions have occurred within public institutions. That's an interesting thing because the public institutions part of it here, and the reason I highlight that is, of course, if it's a public university, it is under the control of the state. And in the United States, of course, that at least means that it has to be bound by the First Amendment in that. So it actually does make a decent amount of sense to see that there. But what's more interesting is what comes after that. Adoptions within public institutions are often driven by governing boards or in some cases state legislatures that have legally mandated wholesale adoption of neutrality across public institutions of higher education in their states. We also found that university presidents were more likely to be the drivers of neutrality adoptions at 33 private institutions with no neutrality policies. Institutions classified as R1s, meaning that they have a very high degree of research activity according to the Carnegie classification system, account for a sizable share of neutrality adoptions, though they represent a small share of the thousands of colleges across the United States. At least 52 R1 universities had official policies in place at the end of 2024. Institutional statement neutrality is being embraced on college campuses across North America. The timing is fortuitous. Given the current climate, the demands on institutional leadership can be head-spinning. Institutional neutrality encourages institutions and their leaders to remain focused on fighting battles that keep their campuses centers of spirited inquiry and open debate. Does your institution have one? Are they missing from our list? Let us know. So this last part is the key component, and actually why I'm kind of really glad to see it, although maintaining it and testing it, of course, because so many of them have adopted it, you got to test whether or not they're actually going to keep it. So let some controversy happen and see what happens, see what the university does. So here's the interesting thing. Of course, there is a lot going on to challenge that kind of thing right now, but it is a good thing that it's happening. It's not necessarily the job of the university itself to be doing any critiques of what's going on in society, but it is the job of the people at the university to be doing that as part of their job and seeking the truth and all that jazz in there. But you gotta be able to keep a spirited inquiry, open debate at universities to do that. And I do think having a university administration that's dedicated to allowing that debate and argument, even if you find it repugnant yourself, whatever is being said, is important. And so it's actually really encouraging to me to see the growth in institutional neutrality statements. There is another piece here that is from today, talking about how you can take stands on this. And this is something I want to say with it because, of course, institutional neutrality means in most things, it's not the job of the university to respond to it. But there are some cases where that's the case, that a university should respond to it. And that's actually what makes a good point here in this particular thing from Free the Inquiry today. More than 150 universities and colleges have now committed themselves to policies of statement neutrality, and the majority adopting such policies in the past year. Consequently, they will generally refrain from taking official positions on contested social and political issues. Institutional neutrality is not a form of censorship. It is, in fact, quite the opposite. As the University of Chicago's Calvin Report advised, quote, "The instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or the individual student. The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. End quote. When institutions of higher education remain neutral on social and political issues, their scholars and students can be anything but. In other words, the institution doesn't put a thumb on the scale to say the student should be this or the student should be that. They can involve in their own thoughts on that one. By preventing the chill faculty and students can feel when the institutional voice disagrees with their own, institutions remain committed to open inquiry and exploration. When a social or political controversy captures public attention, a college or university has a unique opportunity to elevate and improve public debate. Its scholars can articulate and defend their expert opinions. Its campus can host thoughtful discussions. Its student, faculty, and staff can freely formulate and express novel views that enrich the range of possibilities to be considered. But what happens when real-world events do seem to demand a formal institutional response? This scenario raises two questions. Under what conditions should an institution deviate from its general policy of statement neutrality to weigh in on a social or political issue? And when such statements are appropriate, what constraints must the institution follow to maintain fidelity to the ideal statement of neutrality? The first question is particularly thorny, as there's no algorithmic solution that just tells us when an institution is justified in taking a stance on a social or political issue. However, in Extraordinary You, the HXA model of statement neutrality, Heterodox Academy has proposed a useful framework. Institutions should speak out when and only when an issue, quote, directly, significantly, and specifically affects the academic mission of the institution. Let's unpack these three criteria of directness, significance, and specificity. Directness. How close? An issue must affect the academic mission through immediate first-order effects rather than indirect ripple effects. To illustrate this distinction, consider two contrasting scenarios. Suppose the state legislature passes a law that directly restricts what professors can teach in their classrooms. Such a scenario would clearly meet the directness criterion because the law in question immediately impacts the core educational function of the university. On the other hand, general political turmoil that might eventually lead to decreased enrollment would not qualify, as the turmoil is far upstream of any direct impact on the academic activity. A key is distinguishing between immediate effects on academic functions versus longer causal chains that may, but won't necessarily, eventually affect the institution. Significance. The significance criterion requires that an issue's impact on the institution's academic mission be truly substantial rather than merely peripheral or incidental. To illustrate this distinction, consider two scenarios. A law that bans scholars from inquiring into certain research topics, or bans research involving certain keywords, would clearly meet the significance threshold. Such a restriction would fundamentally impair a university's ability to pursue knowledge and advance scholarship. In contrast, a new state requirement that universities submit additional paperwork when purchasing laboratory equipment, while creating administrative burden, would not rise to the level of significance that warrants breaking statement neutrality with a public statement. Such a policy might be ineffective or frustrating, but it doesn't fundamentally impair the university's ability to conduct research or educate students. The key question is whether the impact meaningfully compromises core academic functions rather than creating more administrative friction or peripheral challenges. Specificity. How focused? The specificity criterion requires that an issue's impact be particular to the missions of the academic institution rather than broadly affecting society at large. Consider, for instance, policies regarding student visas and student immigration status. These clearly meet the specificity requirements since they distinctly affect universities' ability to maintain an international student body, which may be a core part of their missions. In contrast, general economic policies that affect all sectors of society equally, such as changes to interest rates or broad tax reforms, would not meet this criterion, even if they impact universities alongside other institutions. The key distinction lies in whether the issue creates unique challenges for academic institutions or merely affects them as part of broader societal challenges. So, therein is a bit that I wanted to say with that is that institutional neutrality, of course, does not mean that a university cannot speak about certain things. It should, if it's very direct and significant impact to the primary mission of the university, which is the pursuit of the truth and the education of students. And so, passing on knowledge to the next generation, those kinds of things. But they go on further to say what's the ideal kind of statement here. The three criteria that help determine when an institution may take a public stance on a social or political issue also provide guidance on how it should speak. Even when universities and colleges determine that deviating from statement neutrality is warranted, they should follow a bounded advocacy model. It cannot just be willy-nilly on different things here, is what they're getting at. Focus on specific mission impact. Rather than making broad moral proclamations or taking sweeping political stances, institutions should narrowly focus their statements on explaining how the issue specifically affects their mission and how taking a stance on that issue is done in the aid of that mission. For example, instead of condemning a political movement broadly, a university might specifically address how certain proposed policies favored by that movement would specifically and negatively impact its research or teaching capabilities or academic freedom. Show clear causation. Statements should clearly articulate the direct causal link between the issue at hand and institutional impact. This means avoiding arguments based on indirect effects or speculation about chains of consequences, and instead focusing on immediate first-order effects on functions core to the university's mission. Substantiate the size of the impact. When speaking out, institutions might provide concrete evidence of to what degree their mission would be affected. This might include specific data, examples, or detailed explanations of how core university functions would be impaired. The bounded advocacy approach helps institutions maintain their commitment to statement neutrality, even when they determine they must speak out and take a side. It ensures that when universities do take positions, they do so in a way that remains tethered to their missions, rather than drifting into broader political advocacy. Consider the difference between these statements. Unbounded advocacy. The university condemns policy X as an assault on human rights and democratic values. Bounded advocacy. Policy X would directly impact our ability to conduct research in the following specific ways. These restrictions would significantly impair our capacity to fulfill our educational mission by specific, direct, significant. The other one, unbounded nonsense, weighing in on a whole bunch of things. The bounded approach maintains institutional credibility while still allowing universities to defend their core functions when genuinely threatened. Statement neutrality isn't about institutional self-muzzling, it is about ensuring that viewpoint diversity and free expression remain cherished pillars of higher education. The framework that highlights considerations of directness, significance, and specificity, coupled with a bounded advocacy model, offers a practical path forward for universities navigating today's contentious social and political landscape, in which there are many policies and changes that may directly and significantly impact the university. There's a lot going on with universities right now, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up, is there are going to be a lot of pressures to make a statement on this, make a statement on that, watch out for this, watch out for that. You really should consider some very bounded things to do that, to addressing that as a university. And you can when you go with an institutional neutrality approach rather than going for unbounded advocacy, as it were. By taking public stances only when core functions are genuinely threatened and doing so in ways that remain tightly focused on the institutional mission, universities' administrators can maintain their unique role in society not as arbiters of social or political matters, but as caretakers of spaces where truth can be pursued through open inquiry and rigorous debate. This approach allows universities to defend their essential functions when necessary, while avoiding the pitfalls of becoming just another voice in our increasingly polarized public discourse. In doing so, they preserve something invaluable: the capacity to serve as forums where difficult questions can be explored, where unpopular ideas can be debated, and where the pursuit of knowledge remains paramount. In an era when many institutions feel compelled to take a stand on every issue, perhaps the most important stance a university can take is to remain true to its fundamental purpose, fostering the conditions that make the search for truth possible. And on that. This is, that's why I wanted to talk about this, is just to make the point, because a university as an institution can take a stand if it's directly going to impact their own mission, which is wise and appropriate to do. You should say that. And hey, this is going to screw with us. And fairness, right and left both do it. But right and left have both caused problems for universities with different things going on policy-wise, and all that has very much happened. But in terms of just general broader policy-related discussions and things going on, that's left to the individuals at the university, not to the university itself. So there can be a nice compromise in this that I like with institutional neutrality stuff, and so it makes me happy to see a lot of it get implemented, though I would again make a point of note that so many of them were implemented in the last year that it's going to be interesting to see if they actually stick to it when presented with the first test of that. That's it. That's all I wanted to say on this. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all of that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.